Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This week, I thought we'd talk a little bit about interprovincial trade, which is a sexy topic, but is something that is going to come up a fair amount, both in the news in the last week, but also coming up with the election in the fall. Interprovincial trade barriers have been an irritant since Confederation in 1867. It's one of those things that every government promises they're going to do something about to fix, but it's something that only ever really gets incremental progress over successive years and successive governments. Part of what the problems are is that some of it has to do with local protectionism, which means provinces want to protect their own industries and their own jobs and so on. And some of it is some actually fairly good-natured problems that come up, butt up against one another when things move across the country. Unfortunately, because of the way in which the country is structured, some of those barriers can make it more difficult to trade across Canada than it would be to trade across international borders. This was readily made apparent, especially after NAFTA got signed in the 80s. But also, again, we've seen it with the European Trade Agreement and so on. One of the ways in which this has come up recently was with the Council of Federation meeting last week, which is when all the premiers get together and talk about issues that they have in common. The notion about, the premiers getting together usually every year to talk about interprovincial trade is something that happens all the time. And this year, Alberta's Premier Jason Kenney made a big show about unilaterally taking down some of his province's barriers. Part of that was purely theatrical. A lot of those barriers that he took down were recent ones that the NDP government that preceded him put in place, because NDP governments do like a certain amount of protectionism. But it was also a little bit of theater, because one of the low-hanging fruits that Kenney did not agree to is the National Securities Regulator. This is one of those things where, for securities and financial issues, there are 13 different regulators across the country because of the 13 different jurisdictions. The previous Conservative government tried to unilaterally turn them into a single national one. The Supreme Court told them no. They then went ahead and tried to do a national one, but certain provinces, Quebec and Alberta especially, still say no. Kenney, who was in that Conservative cabinet, surprisingly has not gone ahead and said, yes, this is one of those barriers that we can reduce by simply joining the National Securities Regulator. So that kind of gives you a little hint as to just the level of seriousness to which this is being played. The other thing that we need to remember is part of this is a little bit of PR around the coming election. Some of you might recall that a few weeks ago, Andrew Scheer, who's the Conservative leader, made a speech about his vision for interprovincial trade, and he promised that he was going to solve it once and for all. The usual response to that is good luck, but we also should recall some of the reasons why it is a difficult proposition. There's this kind of notion that Scheer and Kenney and a few others have been trying to put forward that because there are a number of Conservative premiers around the country that they'll somehow make it easier to sit down and get this kind of a deal done. But that kind of doesn't really understand what the barriers are and what some of the reasons behind them are. As well, it's kind of, I'm going to say, ignoring, possibly disingenuously, the progress that the current government has actually made on this issue. Building on talks that started in the previous government's tenure, the current government did get all of the premiers to sign what is known as the Canada Free Trade Agreement, which was a way of trying to accelerate bringing down some of these barriers. And what they ended up doing in that case was creating what's known as a negative list. So that means that by default, all things are freely able to trade across the country with the exception of this list. And the list is long and there's a lot of things on it, but what it does is it gives an enumeration of where the problems are so that they can be chipped away at. And that's exactly what they've been doing. In advance of the Council of the Federation meeting this week, the Intergovernmental Affairs Department put out a release just to kind of remind Canadians about some of the things that they've done over the past couple of years now that they have this agreement in place across the country. There were things on this list like the building, fire, and plumbing codes, which can vary from province to province. Well, they made progress on streamlining those across the country. Safe food regulations, which created one set of regulations instead of 14 different sets. So that's, a fairly big deal. Coming up with a unified list about what's certified as organic. Energy efficiency regulations. Vodka. There were interprovincial barriers around the regulations about what can be called vodka. They managed to get some progress on that, as well as what they're calling the beer standard, which is, again, the regulations around what's able to be called beer. And so things like that. They also created a way of looking into some of the regulations around the country and reviewing them on a more timely basis and trying to make them more flexible. And that's what a lot of these trade barriers are, is regulatory. And part of that is because each province, in their own fairly good-natured way, has their own standards for what they have for health and safety and what is considered safe for things like truck transport, things like that. And it's a lot of that tends to be where these barriers lie. It's also around things like certification for certain professions. So each province regulates their doctors and nurses and plumbers and electricians, and a lot of them will have slightly different qualification standards, number of hours worked or time in school or things like that. And without a lot of federal harmony there, that creates barriers for mobility of labor. And these are things that governments have been working on for a while. It's not something that is necessarily, provinces are doing it just to be difficult. A lot of them have perfectly valid reasons for having the regulations the way they are, and that's something that we don't necessarily talk about when we complain about the trade barriers across provinces. Usually we complain about things like alcohol because that's something that everyone, it's fairly easy to understand. But again, that's one of those barriers which isn't regulatory but has entirely to do with finances. No province wants to give up their monopoly on alcohol sale because they're afraid that another province is going to simply undercut them and it becomes a race to the bottom. With that kind of dynamic in play where nobody wants to give up revenue, it's harder for provinces to come to unified agreements, and that's one of the reasons why it's one of those fairly intractable barriers that's difficult for any government. It doesn't matter what stripe is going to have when it comes to trying to fix this issue across the country. So when we think about what these trade barriers are, we need to just remember that there is really almost no low-hanging fruit left. And that's why promises to take down these barriers once and for all need to be taken with, if not a grain of salt, then possibly an entire shaker. It's difficult work. It's going to involve a lot of sitting down and working out the differences between regulations and provinces, and that work is already underway. The current government put an office in place within Treasury Board that has been doing this work for a good 3 years now, and that's something that we really should remember is already taking place. It's easy enough for political leaders or premiers or even heads of certain business organizations to every year come up and say, you know, we need to make progress on this, and just think of how much, you know, we'll increase our GDP if we can get this done. But it's not that easy. It's not just provinces saying, you know, we're doing this for our own people. It's, you know, it's a myriad of reasons, and, you know, they're not all bad ones. You know, there is a place for local regulation in some cases, and that's why this is, you know, it's a difficult issue, and why we need to take it with a certain amount of skepticism when, you know, party leaders say that they're the one who are going to be able to fix this when nobody else has. Unless they're willing to simply buy their way out of the problem, you know, whether they're going to promise some kind of new transfers or something like that if provinces capitulate. I don't really know how really they hope to do that. I don't know that any of the current political leaders have enough force of personality to, you know, get that job done. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.